Hello, today I will be presenting about transgender students in a single gender school. So the question lies, can an all boys or all girls school enroll a student who is transitioning into a member of the opposite sex? This is a question that principals are increasingly having to confront as transgender children come forward in greater numbers. There's a gender revolution happening in the world that has replaced categories of female and male with a spectrum of multiple gender identities. As a result, educators are having to make adjustments to school policies and practices. In particular, single-sex schools are needing to provide training, track policy direction, and create protocols around transgender students in their communities. With those changes, it calls to question where transgender students fit into the single-sex education program. While school environments will be different from school to school, the legal implications of accepting transgender students varies from public to private schools as well as state to state. Dr. Elizabeth Riley is a counselor in Sydney, Australia, who is an expert in gender identity. She states that schools should have an environment not just of tolerance, but of celebrating difference. In an interview with a news source, The Educator, she pointed out that schools also need to have bullying practices in place to support students in the LGBTQ community. She says, quote, children need to be supported so they can explore where they fit, who they want to play with, and what gives them the optimal opportunity to thrive, engage, and be successful. According to Education Week, about 0.7% of 13 to 17-year-olds living in the United States identify as transgender. That's about 150,000 teenagers. In 2019, at least 366 public schools throughout the nation are either entirely single-sex or have single-sex classrooms, and over 300 private schools were all-girls schools. I bring up private girls' schools as this will be the scope of my research. Some personal background about me. Holy Names Academy is an all-girls Catholic high school founded in 1880 by the Sisters of the Holy Names of Jesus and Mary. According to the school offers excellent academic, arts, athletic, spiritual, and leadership programs that promote the development of the whole person and the environment of inclusion, collaboration, and community. In 2020 and 2021 school year, the school enrolled about 650 young women. I've taught at Holy Names for 10 years, and it has been an extremely formative experience for me. A few years ago, our administration was faced with making a decision regarding transgender student enrollment in the school, as we had our first student apply that was transgender. While many legal issues are faced by both private and public schools, as well as all boys and all girls schools, throughout my research I was looking at the legislation and litigation, focusing on the implications for a religious, private, single-sex school. Not specific to single-sex schools, there are multiple laws that prevent the discrimination of students based on their sex. Title IX of the 1964 Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex. The U.S. Department of Education has stated that Title IX's prohibition of state discrimination encompasses gender identity. Additionally, the Family Educational Rights Act, or Privacy Act, or FERPA, is a federal law that protects the privacy of students' educational records and also gives current and former students the right to amend those student records to match their legal documents. Many states also have anti-bullying laws, such as the Dignity for All Students Act in New York and California's School Success and Opportunities Act. These laws state that a student's gender identity must always be respected. I would like to revisit the quotation from the last slide by the Department of Education. They state that as a result of Title IX, schools must treat transgender students consistent with their gender identity. Now, certain schools are exempt from the requirements of Title IX, but it is still provides some context to the admission and retention of transgender students. According to Julie Mencher, she's an LGBT diversity consultant, out of 33 girls' schools that she interviewed, twice as many schools reported that they would admit male to female students. However, female to male students would only be able to remain as students under certain circumstances. So you'll notice that there's a push to accept transgender female students in all girls schools, but a reluctance to retain transgender male students. Additionally, in a presentation to the National Coalition of girls' schools, she notes that many transgender students in all male schools tend to seek schooling elsewhere. Similar stances have been taken by some colleges. Most colleges in general claim to evaluate applications on a case-by-case basis. This allows schools to refrain from having definite policies. At the core of their missions, single-sex women's colleges exist to embolden women while giving them the benefit of diverse perspectives. Smith College in Massachusetts had a student who applied, but because not all of the applications reflected her femaleness, specifically the FAFSA, the student was denied. Due to the uproar that this caused, the following year, Smith unveiled new admissions policy that no longer used federal forms on the list of documents needed. Scripps, Smith, and Bryn Mawr colleges have all required students to apply as women. So a student who is trans male would need to apply as women. However, these schools also explicitly state that any student who completes the graduation requirements, regardless of their gender identity or expression, is qualified to receive a degree. One relevant legal issue surrounding admitting transgender students into single-sex schools is the use of bathrooms. Many of the court cases and legislation surrounding bathroom use are not specific to single-sex schools. However, they play a role in ensuring that all students of a single-sex school are accommodated in their use of the bathroom. The U.S. Department of Justice and the Department of Education affirmed transgender students should not be singled out to use separate designated restrooms or made to room separately. According to the Department of Justice, transgender individuals must be treated in accordance with the student's gender identity for all purposes. That means transgender women should be treated like cisgender women, and transgender men should be treated like cisgender men. Many individual states have also had legislation and litigation regarding the use of bathrooms by transgender students. Here's a brief overview of those cases. In January of 2014, in Doe versus Clinchie, the Maine Supreme Court found that singling out a transgender student and forcing her to use a restroom separate from cisgender girls was discrimination under Maine law. Similarly, in the case of Coy Mathis in Colorado in 2013, the State Department of Civil Rights found that forcing a 6-year-old student to use a nurse's restroom was discrimination based on the basis of gender identity. Even Tennessee House Bill 1233 requires that a public school provide reasonable accommodation to a person who for any reason is unwilling or unable to use a multi-occupancy restroom. This argument, however, goes both ways. While on one hand we have transgender students and allies rallying for the use of bathrooms that match their gender identity, on the other hand we have parents and families concerned about the well-being and safety of their students in restrooms and locker rooms who are not biologically the specified gender for that space. In Parents for Privacy versus Barr in 2020, it was determined that the policy that allows transgender students to use a school bathroom and locker facilities that match their self-identified gender in the same manner that a cisgender utilizes them does not infringe on the 14th Amendment privacy or parental rights or the First Amendment free exercise rights, nor does it create actionable sex harassment under Title IX. In Washington State, Washington Administrative Code 1623260 regarding gender-segregated facilities allows all individuals to use the use of gender-segregated facilities such as restrooms, locker rooms, dressing rooms, and homeless or emergency shelters that are consistent with the individual's gender expression or identity. In a single-sex school in the state of Washington, transgender students must be allowed to use the restroom matching their gender identity. In an interview with my principal, Liz Swift, she expressed that there is no clear legal guidance surrounding the admission of transgender students to a religious-based single-sex private school. The legal team for determining the stance on this issue was comprised of 2 psychologists and 4 attorneys. Principal Swift notes that most girls' schools have landed in a similar place. We serve students who identify as female. All 4 attorneys recommended that we not have a written policy, but rather decide students' admission and retention on a case-by-case basis. All attorneys also recommended that we be open to transgender girls for the enrollment into Holy Names. We recognize that gender identity can be fluid, so there are many considerations unique to each individual student. At the end of the day, while there may not be clear legal obligation for religious private single-sex schools to admit transgender students, most schools are working towards being accepting of students based on their gender identity. Legal implications as of now primarily lie in the use of bathrooms and other facilities, as those students by law must also have access according to their gender. Thank you.